This is a plague doctor, known for their odd bird-like masks, but surprisingly enough, these masks were designed in such a way to save the life of the wearer from the bubonic plague at the time. And the reason why actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. But before that, let's go back in time to a time where people actually wore these things. So we have to go back to a period in history where the masses were plagued by a deadly disease. And no, I'm not talking about recent years, I mean back in the 16th and 17th centuries. The bubonic plague in particular gives the unfortunate soul who catches it flu-like symptoms: fever, vomiting, headaches. This would turn into swollen lymph nodes, blackened skin, and after 3 or 4 days the bacteria could enter the bloodstream, infecting the organs such as the spleen and the lungs, and the patient would eventually die a few days later. Nasty stuff. Mainly spread by pests and vermin, this was a deadly pandemic that killed millions of people in the 16th and 17th centuries. Commonly referred to as the Black Death. What made this so deadly was due to the fact that it managed to be transmitted around the globe so quickly, with many countries trading and vermin getting on ships and going to different places, bringing the plague over, and then, it's just a terrible state of affairs, guys. Put it this way, we all complain about times now, but just be thankful that we didn't live in the 16th and 17th century, because you'd probably be dead. Me too. So yes, the Black Death. Pretty metal name nonetheless. The Black Death itself spread around much of Western Asia, Europe and Africa. It's a shame it had to kill so many people, but there's always those that have to go out of their way to combat the next big pandemic and try and avert needless deaths. Enter the plague doctors. During these times in the 17th century, physicians of the land would wear these very defining outfits, fit for a plague doctor. The costume is not what you'd expect for a physician of modern times, with these ones looking a lot scarier than maybe people you'd see now. Towns would hire plague doctors who had a particular trouble with the plague to basically try and contain this and stop the rest of the town from getting sick as well. Plague doctors would be hired solely to treat those who had become infected and to ensure the spread of the plague was minimised. After tending to a patient, the plague doctor would be expected to isolate to prevent the spread of the plague, all of which were best practices for something that probably actually helped somewhat. This, however, was not everything they did, as by some modern equivalents they would medicate the ill, provide protective concoctions, and created wills for people. Basically, if it could be labelled with the word death, they probably had something to do with it. The costume is usually credited to Charles de Morn, a physician who catered to the medical needs of many European royals during the 17th century. The long coat's purpose is to understandably restrict contact with the plagued individual they were tending to. Coated with what appeared to cover every inch of skin via breeches connected to the boots and wearing thick leather gloves. And the stick, well, it was just a stick to prod and poke their patients. Like any good doctor has a large big stick that they use to prod and poke their patients with. If I was a doctor, I would do the same because, why would you want to touch a sick person? But there we are. This would normally be topped off with a wide-brimmed hat, linen goods and ankle-long leggings. They took absolutely no quarter here, and they even wore spectacles to cover the eyes to make sure that they were getting touched by nothing. And I don't blame them because the bubonic plague was nothing to laugh about. The whole outfit was designed to prevent miasma, or more commonly known as the reek of the plague. Physicians were of the belief that the plague spread through poisoned air, so they designed the suit to combat just that. The mask itself, being shaped like a beak, has the primary purpose of being filled with perfume and other items to try and mask the senses. Basically getting your big long nose, shoving it full of herbs to try and mask the death and decay that is around you, so maybe you can smell something else apart from your victim dying in front of you. I mean, if you're going to deal with death all day, it may as well smell nice than smell awful. But despite their lack of knowledge in this field, the costume served its purpose and prevented the most common forms of infection, such as being coughed on or preventing the inhalation of bacteria, and even prevented contact such as flea bites that were also known to spread the plague quite significantly. Whilst it may have helped, the reality is that many of the protections that they had would only be the product of a complete unawareness of what was actually happening with the plague in the first place. If only they actually understood modern medicine now, because a lot of what they did didn't really help. If anything, it might have actually made the situation worse. They would do what we would consider some form of medicine, which in modern times is pretty horrific, but at the time they believed this was best practice to try and combat the Black Plague. One such way was the rather unconventional method of something called bloodletting, where they would basically use things like leeches and frogs to try and sap blood from the victim, so basically getting rid of the poisoned blood and then having it being replaced by nice, clean, fresh blood, something which they truly believed was the case at the time. This mismatch of fluids and changes was pretty pointless in the grand scheme of things. What's so strange about this thing is the costume is so iconic, but nobody is quite sure of the origin. It is thought that it might have even been Italy or France, where the prominence of the plague doctors was much more apparent. Maybe it was just the in thing, or perhaps it was because that these countries were ravaged by the Black Death, and wherever you went, plague doctors were soon to follow. If you were unfortunate enough to come down with the bubonic plague and were on death's door, the last thing you would likely see is a plague doctor, resulting in them being heavily associated with foreboding death. A very, very scary thought, no doubt. So, even if their understanding of pathology was completely incorrect at the time, and only for them to realise maybe later how stupid they were being, the actual costumes themselves for the plague doctors were rather effective, and I'm surprised that people in general didn't wear these things because it might have actually prevented a lot more deaths than maybe they originally thought it would. But there we are, the Plague Doctor. If you guys liked that video, here's another one just like it. I'll see you guys in the next video. Fantastic.